My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Lady Baroness Boycott and to agree with, I think, everything she said, but particularly the points about our broken food system. I welcome the Noble Lord and Lady to the front bench. I have worked with both of them extensively on the issues we're debating today and others, in the case of the Noble Lord, Lord Hunt, particularly on health, in the previous Parliament. And I hope that we'll be able to continue to do so on these issues that are not essentially about politics, but the physics and biology of this damaged planet and islands and the unhealthy conditions that it's creating for our people and for the world's people, the One Health perspective that recognises that our health and our economy are entirely dependent on our environment. Now, like the Noble Lady Baroness Hayman and the Noble Earl of Devon, I'm going to take a moment to talk about constitutional issues. Since we two Green peers had to choose 2 of 6 days to speak, a reflection of the urgent need to see more Green representatives in your Lordship's House. We two current Greens do, after all, have 1,931,880 voters to represent, or at least around 90% of those voters, since there's a missing 40 Green MPs in the other place who would be there if the number of votes matched the number of seats. When we think about the Constitution, it's not a question of are people doing the best with what they have, but rather, as Dani Sri Skandaraja, author of the new book Power to the People, is asking, is this really the best we can do in terms of structures? Clearly not. We have multiple environmental crises, but also, as the author says, an apparent crisis of imagination in thinking that we cannot change the deeply dysfunctional political, economic, social and environmental systems that we have now. But constitutional change is not just an issue for the Green Party. It's in all of our interests, in the national interest. It's crucial to the future of our country. Double the number of people who voted for the Labor Party stayed at home. This is the 34% government. With that in mind, I would ask the Noble Ministers, Noble Lords Ministers, about something unlikely to be included in the King's speech, but crucial for starting to build public engagement with our environmental and other decision-making, if they plan to build on the tentative experiments in participative grassroots democracies, people's assemblies, that began under the former party of government. Now, turning to the specific issues of energy, environment and housing, the Green Party embraces and commends many of the steps that the government's taking, particularly on energy. The rooftop solar revolution is long overdue, and the release of the potential of onshore wind is a reversing of the decision that was one of the worst ideologically driven missteps of the last few governments. Although I'd be interested to hear what plans the government has to ensure that this is accompanied by home batteries and electric cars, which through vehicle-to-grid systems have the potential to both support the stability of the grid, reduce the need for further generation, and I'd point the Noble Lord the Minister to a recently published results of a trial in Canberra of that approach. And the Noble Lord the Minister referred to updating the Community Benefits Protocol for renewable energy installations. But what about encouraging community ownership of energy schemes? But the biggest gap in the energy policy is the failure to engage with the reality that the cleanest, greenest, cheapest energy that you can have is the energy that you don't need to use. Where are the plans for the massive upgrading of the housing stock that's essential to both tackling the cost of living crisis and the climate emergency? And further on housing, well, during the election, the Green Party talked about the right home, right place, right price, and will continue to do so. It's pleasing to hear the Noble Lord speaking about insisting that housing developments are accompanied by the essential provision of doctors, schools, public transport. But the handful of oligarchic house builders on which the government seems to intend to rely for housing provision have a track record of failing to deliver even the promised facilities. Again, we have the same problem as I'll get to with the issue of sewage. These are companies whose raison d'etre is to make maximum profit, and that often does not correspond with building houses, but rather in not building houses. And I've heard some expressions of support from this side of the chamber when the noble lord referred to imposing housing allocations on local areas, on local governments. But this reflects on one of the chief intellectual fault lines of the King's speech, that the government talks, at least, about a far more constructive level of engagement working with the nations and the councils of these islands, but then is seeking to prevent them making decisions in the best interests of their communities, according to the will of their communities. And now I turn back to sewage. If you look up the mentions of the words in your Lordship's House this century, there have been a total of 768, heavily concentrated in the last 2 years. I'm sure the whole of your Lordship's House would acknowledge the leadership the noble Duke, the Duke of Wellington, has provided in this area, as the noble Duke did again today, noting that the private companies that own our water systems are, quote, causing appalling damage, close quote. I think the whole House would concur with that. But I'm afraid I very much doubt that the government's measures, as in the King's speech, are sufficient. Water companies and their bosses exist to make profits. That is their statutory duty. And until we bring this essential public service, the monopoly, back into public hands to be run for public good, the incentive to cut corners, to dodge regulation, to pollute, will continue. Now, I haven't time now to cover the other multiple environmental challenges which I'll be raising through other mechanisms in coming days, but to tick off a couple of points. I very much agree with the noble lady Baroness Hayman about the urgent need for the long-promised land use strategy, with the noble Lord Roberah about the need for more support for farmers and the central place for food security in securing our future, with the noble Lord Hunt about the need for a zero-waste economy, something on which UK policy lags far behind many of our European neighbours, particularly in consumer sectors. Big food and big business, one wrestles against the previous government again and again on these issues. I hope we'll see the new government acting differently and standing up to big food and big business. Now, finally, the number one mission of the government, we're told, is growth. Yet we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. We have an ageing population, an ill population, and a society in which lifelong learning provision has been trashed and young people loaded with unpayable student debt, while our universities have been left in a perilous financial position. The noble Lord the Minister talked about creating skilled jobs, but we have yet to hear at all from the government, and I acknowledge it's early days, about creating the skills and understandings we urgently need to tackle our polycrises, particularly environmental but not solely, noting that figures out today show a second annual fall in the number of students applying to universities. And I'd ask the government to think about its definition of skills. We remember, as the COVID report comes out today, how we suddenly realised at the height of the pandemic that many of the low-paid, under-respected individuals in our society were essential workers, and that every job that needs doing, from sewer cleaners to school dinner ladies, school dinner servers to bus drivers, needs to be both decently paid and treated with respect. Every person has a contribution to make to repairing this broken Britain, our environment, our economy, our infrastructure and our society.